role. Thank you for remembering that. Yeah, so we're going to spend this next session on some of our observations and distinctions and ideas about the roles that we play in this work when we take on a job or a part in a rite of passage. So the roles, um, and specifically talking about the role of guide and the role of mentor, and how we might distinguish those in order to gain a little clarity on some of the dynamics that are going on um, in this task of trying to create a supportive space to help others go through growth and transformation. Um, and so I want to start by just suggesting that there really can be a difference in these two different roles, the role of a guide and the role of a mentor, and to acknowledge that, especially in the journey's history, um, these two terms have been pretty conjoined and conflated. And so part of what we're going to do here is just explore how these terms might be distinguished one from the other. When I got on board here at Journeys, all of the guides were called mentors, and they were the program mentors. And they had different sort of adjectives attached to that word, depending on the kind of role and the level of experience that they had. And so during my time here, Journeys has been in the process of trying to distinguish and really shift our thinking about the roles that we hire people to do to come and work at Journeys and lead our trips to be more considered a guide with an opportunity to be a mentor as part of that role. And so that's the first distinction I want to offer y'all in thinking about this, is that we really consider guide to be like a vocational description of a job. It is a job you can get hired for, and it might, it might be you volunteer for it. But what makes it a job for me is the idea that you want to be good at it, and being good at being a guide means being effective for all of the people that you work with. So all of your clients or participants, whatever you'd like to call the people who you're tending and who are enrolled in your program. So this does have sort of a programmatic, institutional feel for like the way in which working with rites of passage is done a lot nowadays, is within this sort of realm of programs run by organizations kind of thing. And so guides are hired by organizations to run a rite of passage program, and they really should expect to be good and effective for every student who shows up, or for every participant who's a part of that program. And the distinction I'll make is that I don't believe that you can be assigned by an institution to authentically hold the role of a mentor in any person's life, anyone who gets assigned to you, right? Like, I just don't believe that's how mentoring works. I believe that, and the distinction I'm trying to make here is that I believe that mentoring happens not because we want it to happen, but because intersections happen between us and other people that gives us the opportunity to play the role of a mentor in their life. And it's not something that we can manufacture or be assigned. Like, you're going to be the mentor to this kid. I do believe that that's sometimes possible for people to have discerning vision of a person and another person, and see that that would be, in fact, there is a intersection there of those people's soul journeys, or lives, such that you'd be a great mentor for that kid. Like, I totally believe that's possible to discern, and have seen people do that and felt like I've done that some myself. But that's different than an organization putting out a program and 10 kids signing up and then saying, all right, you're going to be the mentor to these 10 kids who signed up for this program. Does that make sense, that distinction? Yeah. So it's kind of a soul calling versus a vocation, or even though I know the etymology, those terms are actually rooted in the same thing. But yeah, this idea of a mentor being a little bit more of an opportunity that you're not really in control of, but you definitely have the opportunity to either embrace it or not, kind of thing. And one thing that expresses this really well, that I got from that first class that I took, that I told you about with Michael Mead, um, is the just returning to the actual origins of the word mentor. Um, the word mentor comes from the name of a character in the Odyssey, in the Greek myth of Odysseus. And it turns out that mentor was a family friend who had not gone off to war, had, I think, was old enough to have stayed behind in Ithaca and had been tasked with sort of overseeing or taking care of or supporting the family of Odysseus when Odysseus left. And that when Odysseus left for the war against Troy, um, his son was young, a child. But during the time that Odysseus was away and trying to get back, actually, so it was during his 10-year odyssey to return home, that his son Telemachus, or Telemachus, I don't actually know which is the correct pronunciation, came of age. And it was a really hard time. Father wasn't there to provide any guidance for that. And it was a really strange situation with all these suitors and people hanging out at his house, like uh, wanting to convince his mom that his dad was dead and that she should remarry. And then there would be a new sort of leader of the city of Ithaca. So a lot of confusion there about what his role was and all that. Does he inherit his father's position? Or, is somebody else going to come in and replace his father? All this stuff. And so Telemachus finally decided that he needed to go on a journey of his own to discover what he could about the fate of his father. And so he ended up being lent a ship by a family friend and going on his own journey to try and understand what had happened to his father, and go and talk to some of the others who had returned, friends of his father in other cities who had returned successfully, safely from the war with Troy. So turns out that Mentor was going to be the helmsman of the ship that Odysseus takes on this journey. But then the interesting thing that comes, so there's that component of it of just an older person who's looking after someone, and then can be a guide by steering the ship on this journey into adulthood that Telemachus is taking. But there's another wrinkle, which is that it ends up being the case that the person who's actually steering the ship when Telemachus sails out there is not Mentor, but it is Athena, who has taken the guise of the old family friend Mentor, who is actually the one who is steering the ship and offering advice to Telemachus. So there is this invocation of a divine guidance that a mentor provides. That in fact, the role of the mentor is in some ways to become a vessel through which the goddess of wisdom, Athena, can offer guidance to a young person on this journey. Yeah, so that's kind of the mythical component to this idea of mentor and mentoring. And that's where I feel like it's pretty helpful to invoke that history of the concept and the term when thinking about it as this thing that's like, it's not really it's not something that you can just assign like a good steersman of a ship. Anybody could steer that ship like physically through the water if they were a good, competent steersman, right? But the kind of guidance that Telemachus really needed there was more of a divine guidance from the goddess of wisdom, right? And so this idea of guiding might be more like the actual mentor, and the real mentoring happens is when Athena comes and possesses or takes over him or replaces him. Same guys, so it looks quite the same from the perspective of the participants. They may not see you sometimes as a guide, sometimes a mentor. They just kind of see you as their leader, or their, you as you. But there's going to be these two different components. And so I like to talk to our guides in staff training when we've hired guides and make this distinction and say, I expect you to be a great guide for every one of your students and know how to support them well and create good containers that create trust and create the willingness to be vulnerable and to share and to really, show up for each of these youth. And I expect you to be open and willing to embrace the opportunity to be a mentor if it is presented. If it turns out that you and one or many of your, students or participants end up having some kind of a soul connection, soul conjoining that gives you that opportunity to play the role of mentor for them. And does that make sense as a distinction? Yeah. And so in the similar tradition of mentor in the Greek mythical sort of universe, there's this pretty old idea of the thread of fate, the golden thread that is a part of everyone's life. And so we're going to share with you a great modern poem that kind of captures this idea and gives us a really concrete sort of symbolic tool to talk a little bit about what is this when we're engaging in the mentoring role, what is it that we're doing here? Is that a decent segue intro for you, Gretchen?
That was beautiful. And revealing, taking off her hat, can you see how we just told a story and now we're offering poetry to teach something? It's a good example. So I'll read this through twice. However you want to receive poetry, you might not necessarily receive it just up here, right? That's the point. Maybe it's somewhere else in your body. So maybe close your eyes while you listen to this. Maybe just drop down right now in the center of gravity. That could just be feeling your sits bones wherever you're sitting and taking a few deep breaths, right? How else can we absorb? So this is The Way It Is by William Stafford. There's a thread you follow. It goes amongst things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about this thread, but it's hard for others to see. And while you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and grow old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of that thread. Maybe take a big breath in. One more time. There's a thread you follow. It goes amongst things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing, and you have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. And while you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen and people get hurt or die, and you suffer and grow old. And nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of that thread. Right? So what is the thread in the context of what we're talking about? Now let that question sit, and maybe it is, what is your thread? What thread are you following right now? You spoke briefly in the beginning introductions of what calls you here? What excites you to be spending hours and hours and hours on Zoom? Learning about how to be a teenager, a phase that you got through. What calls you here? Maybe that has something to do with this thread. And the beauty about that poem is that we don't actually have to say exactly what it is. And even if you tried, Gabriel, if you tried to describe your thread, I wouldn't quite get it. And you would feel like words kind of failed. And I would be kind of confused. Right? The beauty about poetry is it uses words to point beyond language a little bit. Right? And so acknowledging we all have threads. Maybe we were born with them. Maybe we picked them up during a big transition in our life, during a loss. Maybe we had a thread that started from a trauma when we were in an adolescent phase. Right? The idea of this quality of mentorship is sometimes your thread intentionally needs to weave for whatever reason with someone else's thread. And that could represent a really beautiful way of mentorship, or a beautiful reason why that mentorship seems to click more than a relationship with a different student. And it might not be exact pinpointing, this is why we are good for each other. And sometimes it might look quite juxtaposed. You might not actually look that similar on the surface level or on the outside. But for whatever reason, this mentorship is what needs to happen. Any just bubblings about what Chris has shared yet? We just gave you a big story and a big poem. And I want to pause before we move on to just see if anything's stewing. And if not, we'll keep going.
Yeah, I can share.
Sure.
Yeah, it's like kind of trying to put words to, something that is ephemeral. But yeah, in the past few years, there was a big shift. I know we've like chatted about somatics, but a big shift of like, I still operate a lot from like the mind, rational brain, and but this thread has made itself more well known if like I start moving towards something that I think I need to do, like to be in society or to like, and then all of a sudden, it's like I can't go in that direction anymore. Like my body shuts down. It's just like it won't let me go in that direction anymore. And it was a really interesting shift that did kind of start happening around COVID. So it's been in the past couple of years. And then there's almost like this cloud. It's like I can't operate that way anymore. And so then, I reorient to like, where is that thread, or like, where is the joy and where is the happiness? And then like, I can start moving in that direction. And it's almost like a funnel, like funneling towards, hopefully what is that like, I don't know. I mean, a thread or like fate or like soul's purpose or whatnot. So yeah, just sharing that different way.
Many gems in that. One, you just went through a big transition, it seems, and a new way of being in the world that literally you cannot go back through the thresholds that you've been through. But one of the signs that there is a thread, which you kind of mentioned, between you and another person, or just a thread between you and an activity, is that kind of passion and that enthusiasm and that draw that doesn't come from my mind being like, okay, I'm good at this work, I'm going to go to work, it's important to make a living, the justifications up here. There's a passion, there's a pull that pulls your heart forward, that says I have to, like when I say that, my body has to move forward, right? And sometimes it is finding, is there a shared passion between you and a student, right? And that could be a sign that like, ooh, your threads could be beautiful, and it could be as simple as like, I have this pull towards listening to birds, and they also have this pull to listening towards birds. That's one sign. Great. Tanner, I see you unmuted. Do you have something you want to share?
Totally, yeah. I
Right.
think it definitely has a good pull to this thread, and it's a poem as well, if you're up
Great.
for a poetic share.
Sure.
Sweet. So I'm just going to start. Intention is elusive, prismatic, and finite. It drives, dictates, and deciphers, ever bending the needle of the moral compass. The soul is curious, the heart open, the mind quiets with every falling sun. A path has been forged, tamped by many a marching soldier, leading to a thicket. In that thicket, a new path, loamy, natural, and raw, marked by only the littlest of the forest creatures. The forest creatures drive the progression of the path. The vegetation dictates their direction. The earth, the sun, and the rain deciphers the richness of the soil. I intend to follow in and lead to the path of the earth, the sun, and the rain. So it's, I think, a decent little segue into thread. What pulls?
Does that poem feel resonant to your own thread?
Yeah, it's the letter of intent I wrote going into my vision fast, and so it resonates quite well with my thread.
I assumed that was self-authored. I didn't want to go far with that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm letting it digest for a second, but.
I'll put it in the chat so you can read it over if you want.
Great. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to offer another few signs of threads, and then I'll hand it back to you, Chris. Like we said, passions and gifts, or passions and enthusiasms, gifts, right? Natural, that could be natural talents. That could also be, like we talked about, the gift of each phase, right? That could be a shared gift. You know, we might have all made it through adolescence, but that doesn't mean that we don't necessarily carry a fire as a gift. We might be fiery people as adults, right? So a shared gift, and I heard that some in the poem also, is that either acknowledging like, this is a gift I have in relationship with nature, or this is one that I want. And so looking for, you know, Chris has given some really good examples of gifts that might not be obvious gifts, but clearly talents. Like, what happens when the kid brings out the magic cards and his whole way of being changes? You know, does someone else, is there a guide who has that same kind of knack? Right? And that could be a simple sign of mentorship. And maybe the gifts are a little out of the ordinary, a little like quirky or eccentric. You know, it might not be the obvious, like, oh, that is an assertive leader, that is a nonviolent communicator. Could be quirky. And then third is wounds. And that's a one word to describe a large category. But at some point in time, have you experienced a same hurt, a same ouch, a same wound, a same transformative experience that was not digested well? Right? And that could be a sign of mentorship. And with any of these, you know, we are saying the tip of the iceberg, and there's more complexity underneath, and especially with wounds, because you are oftentimes still in the guide role. You know, if I am a mentor for a student, I am likely still their guide and still in charge of responsibility and being the adult, right? And it's up to discretion, your own personal discretion, and your guide team and your organization, if that's who you're working for, around what's the right level of personal disclosure about your own personal past, especially, I think, in regards to wounds. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give the full explanation to your mentee of why your threads might weave well. But that could be something that we could feel like, oh, this youth is going through something that hurt me real well when I was an adolescent. And I've done a lot of healing work, and not coming in to fix this person. But like we said, I have an ability to give them company in their particular darkness. I know that particular darkness quite well. And I'm actually okay and comfortable and able to still maintain my adult self and still go sit and company their darkness. Could be an example of that wound. Like passion, enthusiasm, gifts, wounds. Those could be signs of threads. There could be many more, but some to think about. And those don't necessarily say like, oh, you're both from Minnesota, you should be that person's mentor, right? Those are a little bit harder to identify and to point to.
Yeah, early on in my career, when I was guiding, teaching with youth in the nature connection sort of outdoor setting, I had one kid, Michael, who was with me for several years. It was a school year program, so I was with him several days a week out in the woods for several years. And at one point, a new archery shop showed up and opened up in the town, Duval, where we were. And so our class went and visited. There was 8 or so youth that I was working with. So we went and checked out the new archery shop, and it was cool because we had done bow making, and Michael was definitely way into archery. So he was super excited about this shop. And it was a traditional archery shop too. It wasn't just sort of the modern compound bows, but it was these long wooden longbows and things like that. So kids went in and had a great time, and we hung out for half an hour or so. And then we left. And as I was walking out, the guy came out from around the corner, and he just kind of grabbed my arm and he said, you know, there's something that's just calling out dad to that kid there. And I was like, well, really interesting. I mean, I know a little bit about his, you know, family life, and I haven't heard anything. It seems like he's got a good relationship with his father or whatnot. But that guy, just from that little time in the shop, not talking about fathers at all, right? He just said, he's like, there's something about father with that kid. And later, as I came to know Michael better, turned out there was a lot of father stuff going on with Michael, you know, and he had just nailed it right away. So that was a great example for me of like, wow, there are times when people just know, you know, and I guarantee you that if we were to talk to that archery store guy, it was because, you know, his experience, probably wounding, because that seemed to be the quality of it with Michael. With his own father was similar, right? And so there was a real just kinship there, a real entwining of threads that I wouldn't say, at all like was part of my, like I didn't see it initially. It certainly never popped for me. I got it after really getting to know Michael well, but that wasn't part of my mentoring relationship with Michael necessarily. Was anything to do with sort of the father piece of him growing up. But that really brought it home for me how powerful these can be. And you could just imagine it in a place where Michael wasn't part of a class, but just was a kid in that town, and he wanders into the store because he loves archery, that a real sort of what we might call a non-programming or based like mentorship could happen of Michael just hitting it off and that guy seeing something. And if he's just got enough of an open heart and a willingness, which he clearly did, because he pulled me aside and he said what he had seen. So it wouldn't have surprised me at all if Michael, like, absent the program he got to do with me at the Wilderness Awareness School, had just been growing up in this little town of Duval, might have found a mentor in that way and have apprenticed at the shop. And they would basically be focused on archery the whole time. And yet there would also be this other component of Michael just being able to hang out with someone who had a similar, in this case, thread that goes through a wounding from the father, and is able to find out a way to navigate that. Clearly this older man who successfully opened up a shop figured out some way to navigate life with that wound, and could very well have been something that, without ever having talked about that dynamic necessarily, could have been a real mentoring opportunity. So for me, that's always just been a really great example of what we're talking about when we're talking about that moment. And I think the piece that's really always struck me also about that is that these things don't necessarily have to, mentoring in particular doesn't necessarily have to happen within the context of a great formal commitment. I'm going to be your mentor, and that means I have this really important role to play in your life, kind of a thing. It can very much happen in just these moments of mentoring moments that don't necessarily have a big sort of production about them or marking about them. And you may never even know that you played a role of a mentor for someone, right, in your life. It could very well be that a group of kids come through and there's something about you and one of those kids that's just really powerful, and they're being in your presence and getting the opportunity to experience what you offer and the things you say just intuitively. You don't even realize why you're choosing to use those words or talk about those things. But you're just being yourself. You're just really being authentically you in the moment. And they go off and you'll never know, but you had a really, really profound impact on them in a mentoring way. You ended up being an example and a role model, and pointed them in a direction and gave them some kind of an acknowledgement that wasn't even intentional on your part, but was a really important, powerful thing. So this is where, and this is how I'd like to talk about just really encouraging everyone who's stepping onto this path to just be open to that possibility that you can be a mentor to someone potentially without even realizing it, but just be open to that opportunity. And it really takes nothing more than a willingness to be authentically you. That's how they will be attracted to you, is because you are expressing yourself as fully as you're able to. And then that will just be sort of like a magnet that attracts people for whom you can be a mentor. You can be that Athena wisdom for them in their life without even realizing that that's what you're doing. There was a cool moment when early in my days working at Wilderness Awareness School, we were working a lot with a man named Jake Swamp, and he was a member of the Mohawk Nation up in upstate New York from the Akwesasne community. And he was the director of a not-for-profit that the group of people there in Akwesasne had created called the Tree of Peace Society. And the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, of which the Mohawk are one of the nations, have this foundational story of the peacemaker, and of this story of 1,000 years ago, how the peacemaker arrived and provided the basis for a civil society that ended this dreadful war that was just plaguing their different tribes during that time. And so he had this society that basically the mission was to share this cultural tradition that the Haudenosaunee had with the world, because they could see pretty easily that the message that the peacemaker brought 1,000 years ago to their community was desperately needed in the whole world. So he found Wilderness Awareness School, the organization I was working with, just because our founder showed up at a couple of his talks and then sat afterwards and talked with him. And he eventually ended up really having a strong relationship with us. And so would talk about things. And during one of those chats that we were having about the work we were doing, what was happening, he shared with us this idea of the natural gift, and that in his community, it's a pretty overt belief that everyone has a gift. And that gift is medicine that the community needs. And so their community is oriented around this idea of being on the lookout for what are these gifts that the young people are bringing, right? Every young person is welcomed into the world with, yay, we're so excited you're here because we know you've got something, that our community needs, some salve and some medicine for us. We don't know what it is yet, but we're looking forward to finding out what it is. And then a corollary of that I thought was a really cool little piece of it was he said that in addition to everyone having a gift to bring to the community, everyone also has the gift of the capacity to see someone else's gift and to recognize and acknowledge it. So it's not the case that it's just going to be obvious to everyone what each gift is as it arrives. It really going to be something that might be hard to see, right? There is a thread you follow, but it's hard for others to see. And part of this, I think, mentoring dynamic is that those times when actually you are able to see a little bit of the quality and the direction of that thread for someone else. And so they have this encouragement, within their community to please embrace that and remember that it's almost part of your civic duty as being a member of this community, to trust yourself and to engage with others in such a way that you might, get that opportunity to recognize a gift that has arrived. You might be the only one who will be able to see it, because often the person, the poem talks about you always follow the thread, even though, it's hard to explain to others about it. Well, sometimes you'll find that it's really hard for yourself to find and follow the thread, that it really gets obscured within your own life. And I imagine we could all sit and meditate a little bit and find those times in our lives where, it felt like I was sort of rudderless or guideless and didn't have a secure hold on that thread and a feeling that I was moving in the way my life was sort of meant to unfold, so to speak. So that idea that within our community, there are for sure mentors, more people who embrace that idea and a willingness to be that mentor, right? The better off all of us will be. For me, it was a really inspiring way to think about a pretty simple but concrete way in which we can make some progress in this area that we all seem to feel, which is that I'm not being seen. There is no sort of welcoming circle that's waiting for me to step into in my community that is looking for my gift. But there's nothing stopping us from just beginning that process right now of being willing to trust ourselves and welcome the gifts of others. And of course, you gotta, remember about projection and not just, seeing it and acknowledging it in someone else because you so desperately need that acknowledgement yourself that you're kind of projecting that on to them. There's just a careful balance you need, or at least some humility that you need to go into with around that, and a knowledge of our own woundings and whatnot. But I really like that, those examples and some of that wisdom from Jake Swamp about this, and I love that idea that a community actually had that as part of its core values, that was shared widely. Like, every child's important to us. Every child brings a gift, and we all have the capacity to see that and recognize it.
To point out some obvious, right? A mentor sounds way different than a school counselor in the way that we described it, right? At least how I received my high school counselor was because my last name started with a G, and that's not really the thread we're talking about. Naming that and naming, I think what Chris has described, but just to point it out, is how much it helps to let the youth also decide who they feel as though is their mentor. And that's something that Journeys tries to role model of the best that we can with logistics is, which guide is the youth really kind of naturally drawn to? And let's trust that. And let's let that person be their mentor. And that can be a great way of also kind of getting out of it's hard to sometimes get out of our cognitive brain, or it's hard to get out of our adult projections. Like, we've practiced our thought patterns a lot. And sometimes it's really nice to just go off of the instinct and the impulse of the student, who probably knows very little about you, and you might know a lot more about them, right? So that can be a way of trusting that thread. It's letting youth kind of step into that role. Just curious.
Actually, can I just clarify a little bit on that, Gretchen?
Mhm.
Yeah, so what you're referring to is that in addition to there being, guides, and you're the guide for the whole trip, at Journeys, we'll set up opportunities for one-on-one meetings where we are sitting just sort of one-on-one with students to begin that conversation. Tanner, you talked about it, of exploring the intent statement. We definitely will talk about that next weekend as a tool to help people as part of that solo process, as part of that real core liminal phase of the rite of passage, to explore some of this stuff. We sit with them and do a little just listening session, we might call a mirroring session, where we try and help them. And so that in that way, we're talking about the role of, or mentoring role for each kid. And we make sure that everyone gets a chance to have someone sit with them, and we let the kids choose who they want to sit with for that one-on-one conversation. So that's what Gretchen was referring to with that idea of letting the kids decide. And then sometimes we'll also just it'll be obvious. Maybe the kid, because they're nervous or because they're anxious or whatever, chooses somebody else or whatnot. And yet, as a group of guides, you will notice an affinity, right? And there's just like this magnetic pull, and that kid's always hanging around you, Chris. I think you should, I know it's not your job, and Gretchen's their mentor, but why don't you sit too and just like have lunch with them or something like that? Like, it looks like there's an opportunity there, something's brewing, because we can see the connection there. Yeah, so there's sort of a combination of structurally built-in parts to that idea of creating mentor opportunities, and then an openness to it being really informal and non-structured.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Who's got a mentor in this group right now? Just show of hands. That you can say oh, this person is a mentor. And remembering it could be a moment. It doesn't have to be a lifelong relationship. It could be momentary. See, I saw Tanner's hand go up. Maybe I wasn't watching. Jean Marie, Gabriel. Are they older? Just me being curious. In age, are they older? Or do you know?
I have a few people I consider mentors, and one is older, one might be around my age.
We've definitely ran through a fair amount of different male mentors seemingly through my life. Probably in my early 20s is when it really came into fruition, and they're almost always roughly 20 years older than me, right around there. It seems pretty common.
Could be your father.
Totally.
Yeah.
Just curious, and an interesting thing to think of, is there anyone in your life that is only in the role of mentor without serving other roles in your life? Again, I'm just trying to throw out seeds to get curious about this position as we have distinguished it from guide, or as we have distinguished it from other types of roles that you could play in someone's life, right? And we're about ready to pivot and start talking about the guide. So just leaving space here. Any questions, any comments, anything else to add or to wrap up with mentor?
Maybe just I met a gentleman this retreat a few weekends ago, and he's actually doing professional mentoring. He's working primarily with 18 to 24-year-olds, a lot of kids going through the college ages and such, but he's made it a business. He holds about 20 clients right now, and I wasn't sure if you guys have seen other people doing that in a profitable way. It doesn't have any necessarily college background or psychology degree or anything like that, but just mentoring. I was kind of surprised to hear it.
Yeah. And I will say that just because we just find it in this way, or this is the way that we relate in Journeys, or the story of Athena and mentor, does not mean that that's everyone else's. I've definitely been worked for other organizations that use that word mentor in different ways. So I would be curious, what is his definition of mentor? And does he use mentor to distinguish himself from a therapist or a life coach? And does it mean something to what we're talking about? I definitely think that like we haven't gotten really into the role of money in this work, and that's not really in the scope of this workshop, but maybe he is following some sort of thread. Maybe he has a way to do outreach that really demonstrates, here are some threads that I am able to mentor in, or maybe he's working with a different definition of mentorship.
Yeah, and something that comes up with that observation or whatever, I would agree with what Greg was saying, that there's probably a way in which if we really talked about what we meant by that, we'd totally agree. And I would say something like along the lines of, oh yeah, you're being both a guide and a mentor, that kind of a role that you've set up for yourself in that kind of a situation for sure. But I guess what I was, and maybe we'll get a little bit more into this at the end of this conversation, is just, being aware that it's pretty easy to draw clear distinctions about what's appropriate and inappropriate, say, to talk about as far as you sharing your own personal experience and story in the guide framework, where it's just kind of being a good professional adult working with kids. You don't want to overstimulate them. You don't want to cross boundaries of professional ethics around what kinds of topics you talk about. And then you get into the mentoring role, and you're sort of often put up with this, like, well, the reason we're drawn together here is because we might share something, and that could be something really hard that happened in our lives that you might not normally share that with kids. Like that might just be too much information or an inappropriate level of information to talk about yourself in a detailed way. But might find yourself thinking that might be a valuable thing to offer this particular youth given their particular situation. So I guess, I'll maybe just leave it at that with this idea that we can find some safety in the professional guidelines that we receive with these kinds of roles, like counselor and guide, trip leader, people like that. And then when you bring in mentoring, it's like, actually, we're just being real humans here. And so you sort of are stepping into, in this particular paradigm, dangerous territory potentially. So just to be aware of that, I'm not really offering any guidance on how to navigate that, but to just realize that there's going to be some places where if you start to talk to kids about your own sexual experiences as a kid their age, you're going to get in big trouble institutionally or organizationally or whatever as having crossed a line that you should not cross. Even though it may feel like from that mentoring perspective, that conversation, and for them to feel like it's not their fault and that they're still an okay person, that happened to them because they realized and they get that affirmation from you that happened to you too, could be exactly what they need, right? So like this is where programming meets real life, and the heuristics of guidelines and things are great and they're necessary handrails, but sometimes whatever, you just find yourself in a situation where it's ambiguous as to what you should do or how you should navigate that situation. And offering yourself up to Athena definitely can be one of those careful what you wish for. There's aspects of it that can be really messy.
I feel like there's some important topics around just professional accountability and personal accountability when we step into these roles, and when we're working outside of a professionalized kind of structure. Even within there, that can be violations, but at the very least, some of that professionalizing structure is intended to build in some accountability, such as having someone who is a supervisor or a guide to the person who's doing mentoring or guiding or counseling or any of these things. So I guess I just always ask myself, where is the network of personal accountability, and not working outside of that as an individual, and personally or professionally is really important to me. So I just wanted to offer that. If you all have any insights or suggestions, maybe especially when I'm actually working for an organization right now that unfortunately doesn't provide the level of structure and accountability that I wish that they did for someone in my type of role, doing the work I'm doing with youth. So I'm like, having to find ways to institute that for myself, to hold that for myself. And so, yeah, just curious if you all have any insight into how to, yeah, support that personal accountability. When an organization or institution or whatever group you're working with, maybe isn't emphasizing or providing that well.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for bringing up the question. I think that level of questioning is foundationally necessary for any program. Doesn't matter what kind of, if it's a supervisor or a guide or a 10-year guide or a first-year guide, that is a whole workshop in itself. And thank you for asking it here too, and we won't dive into all of it, but simply having a co-guide does a lot, even if you don't have someone that is in a supervisor type position all the time. I think, okay, I would say first, I'll just talk about myself. I check in with my system. Does something in me feel like it is on an edge that feels less familiar? Because usually the part that is professional for me, unless I'm in a growth situation, it doesn't really activate my nervous system as much. If there's a part of me that's like, ooh, I don't really know. As soon as I get that kind of side body feeling and that ooh, that's a first cue of go to your co-guide. Doesn't even matter. Pause the situation, slow the situation down, right? Because it might feel really good for me to, as a person, to have someone that has my same thread, and I might really want to share. And it's just pause, slow it down, go to your co-guide, get another brain on the topic, I would say that's kind of the first level of response. And then, yes, we need more levels of, is there a supervisor on call? Does the organization have access to someone that has a therapeutic degree? Not saying that gives them the all-wielding power of saying what is personal and what is professional, right? But can we bring other minds to it? And I also come from a background of working wilderness therapy, so I might have larger boundaries around personal and professional than some organizations do. Right? It was a curve. It was an edge for me to be more in the mentorship and less in the guide because of my experience in wilderness therapy, or because there was a lot more boundaries around personal disclosure. But we were at the level that our students didn't know our last name. We were quite distant figures. I think I might have a little bit more of an activated, ooh, I don't know if I can share this kind of a feeling. And my other way around it is, who are you sharing for? And that has been a great compass or barometer for me. Am I sharing this because it's for me, even if it's for a little tiny part of me that I don't want to admit? Am I sharing this because it really would benefit the student? And if it really would benefit the student, typically I can let go of a lot of details or even personal identification with the story. And I can pull out a lesson that was still helpful for the student. And that's not to be in all cases, but I think oftentimes the lesson can also be supportive if given in that kind of way that removes your many of your personal details. But thank you for bringing the question up.
Yeah, and I know that there was a really strong movement a little while ago at back when I was at Wilderness Awareness School for mentors to specifically have as part of their resource bundle, in addition to what this organization was able to offer, a strong encouragement to find someone that we called an anchor. So someone who you knew and you trusted, and they liked you enough that they would be happy to, have dinner with you once a month and just have a check-in and, hey, how's it going? And how are you finding yourself doing working with these folks that you're working with? And that's a person that you can then run by the edgy stuff that might be coming up. Hey, what do you think about this? I find myself really deep in conversation around this, blah, blah, blah. How's that doing? So just, yeah, finding an anchor and trusting that person, and even just the presence of that person in your life. Then would I tell this to my anchor, or how would I feel about sharing what I'm about to do with the student, with that anchor? And you can almost just at that point be like, they'd probably start asking some pretty sharp questions, to help me distinguish my motivations here, whatever. So even their presence in your life can be, even if they never ended up having to offer that, just by being that and holding that space for you can be really supportive in that way.
Anything else on mentor before we switch to guide? Cool. Maybe Chris, why don't we go through guide and then we could take a little break after guide things?
Yeah, hopefully.
People
And
good
if we
with
need
that
to take a break anyway, we'll do it.
Cool.
Yeah, so guides. Again, so trying to invoke that holistic job description or role that you play that involves being the one of a team of people. And I really hope that, you know, from my perspective, a guide, part of the definition of a guide should be team member, right? It's like, I really feel like solo guiding is almost like necessary sort of triage, like emergency medicine kind of a thing, but that if it's ever being done in any way that's sort of like planned and designed and whatnot, I'm a super big fan of teamwork in some way or another, and that has something to do with my own personal, obviously, journey through it, and also some I think some sense of the kind of world that we're living in now. And I don't know that that necessarily would be an admonition that would be appropriate or relevant in all times, in all places that humans have lived together in communities. But I do feel like in our moment, with the amount of damage that we're dealing with, solo guide work is perilous. And so it's just strongly encourage you to work in teams of whatever form you can find with that level of support. Yeah, for sure. So I guess okay, now we're going to transition. I'm just repeating what we said before, but for whatever reason, it occurred to me to say that is a key part of this idea of guiding and what the role of the guide is. And yeah, so there we can kind of break down this otherwise what would be, you know, a pretty large nebulous job description of, well, just do everything well, you know, with these people that are in your care. So we'll break it down into 4 roles. There's a lot more than that, I'm sure, but we'll identify 4 sort of subdivisions of this role of the guide, and hopefully these will be helpful distinctions for you as you begin to sort of take on, and what pieces am I good at and what pieces should I partner with somebody because they're good at that, and then I can learn from being with them, you know, kind of apprenticing with them. So the first piece that we talk about invokes this idea of the rite of passage as a journey, that archetypal energy, and so we talk about it as the journey master. And you know, master's potentially a loaded word, so there's some effort now to try and come up with what a synonym could be for someone who knows the journey pretty well, has traveled the terrain before, and obviously one of the words for that would be a guide, right? Like a guide is someone who knows the path and can take them down on the path. So that's sort of a narrowing of the term guide that we're trying to get at when we talk about a journey master. And we've talked about all of these frameworks and whatnot as maps. And so I think when we talk about a journey master, we really are talking about somebody who not only do they have the maps in their possession, they've got the books, they've taken the workshops, right? They know the theory behind the maps. They've also spent a lot of time out there in the terrain, actually on the journey, actually exploring it. Been there before, right? Not that they're the expert who is, you know, telling everyone what they should do in that terrain, but it's just super helpful when you're trying to encourage someone and support someone in exploring this terrain, to have some experience with it yourself. So that's a big part of the journey master. And you know, just like any good teacher or guide, like there's moments to guide the way, show the way, lead the way, and there's moments and opportunities to step aside and let people explore the terrain on their own and sort of discover it for themselves, what's going on. And so that's part of the art of the journey master, is to know how much direction to give sort of from the front, right? Leading from the front, and how much is when to step out of the way and let them step forward along the trail or along the path or into the terrain. Is that too metaphorical, or does that make sense as far as the role of the guide? And this really could be as simple as like you for the first day or so being the one at the head of the trail, figuring out which way to go at forks in the trail and showing them the map and how to do it. And then, by day 4 or 5, they're the ones with the map and they're the ones making making the choice about which way to go at the forks in the trail. And you let them go. And then pretty soon you start asking questions from the back. Hey, does this look like what it looks like on the map? Because you're going the wrong way, but you're asking the questions and, giving them an opportunity to figure out, wait a minute, why are we going uphill? We're supposed to be going downhill, right? And then they figure it out. So anyway, a simple example of the Journey Master. I think that there's a lot of the Journey Master that is more about demonstrating the qualities of character that are required to navigate the terrain, as opposed to the knowledge or the particular skill that might be involved. Like you might be great at starting fires and they just struggle with fires. But in what way can you be an example of how do you persevere and how do you go about getting better at this and continuing to engage with something that you're finding is difficult, right? Sticking with it and continuing to explore a thicket that just feels dense and not impenetrable, and I just don't want to mess with it anymore. So there's that sort of leading by doing or by being, just in who you are and how you are, and engaging with, again, with the example that comes to mind is the weather. And it's like bad weather or insects or bugs or stuff like that can just shut people off entirely from engaging on the journey, literally wanting to go into the wilds and the wilderness. And for you to just demonstrate an enjoyment of the moment and enthusiasm in the face of, cold rain or bugs or wind or whatever, and just showing them how you do it so that you can cope and engage and still be having a good time, just being that lead by example person that's basically like willing to say yes and willing to embrace and willing to continue with the experience is a big part of that Journey Master. And sometimes that's from the front and sometimes that's from behind. Yeah, that I think that might be enough. I'm curious if there's any other components that are evoked by this idea of a Journey Master that any of you either have from your own experience or that just come to mind. Gray, if there's anything else you would contribute to Journey Master role.
I wouldn't add any more layers. You guys know me. I would come up with someone in your life, and that could be a Disney character, who personifies this journey guide in your life, right? And that could be a person, that could be someone you read the biography of, right? And I'm also sourcing who are good examples. So if you have a great example of someone that I might know that's like in Disney movies or culture, please unmute and let me know right now. And if not, that's okay too.
One of the
I
was going to say one of the more nuanced layers that we have here at Journeys as we're putting together guide teams is this idea that no one can really embody the fullness of these archetypes. And so specifically around Journey Master, we actually like to include both, if it's possible, right? To include both a really vibrant younger person who is just maybe 4 or 5, steps in front of where these kids are going to be, right? So this might be for the 12 to 14-year-olds that we're working with, coming of age folks, maybe someone who's in college, right? Maybe 20, 21, 22, who's really inspired to come and be that really inspirational guide that's very easy for the youth to imagine themselves being that person. It's realistic, right? They're just 5 years older, and even though they seem like Superman or Superwoman, it's still possible for them to really relate at a pretty easy imaginal level. And then older people too, like people in their 40s guiding trips like this, where it may initially seem like the kids just can't possibly imagine, you know, this person's a father and has got a teenager of their own, and this, that, the other thing. But combining those different manifestations of a journey master who's further along on the path than you are and has an ability to really provide some guidance and offer some support as you move along can be a really powerful thing to do when you're creating your guide teams, is to yeah, try and sort of find that. So I just wanted to offer that distinction between the person who's kind of close to you and what kind of a journey master or journey guide does that provide, and then someone who's like been living this for so long. What does that kind of guidance offer a person? And that can be in your own life too, just somebody who took this class before you did, you know, and then so you've been teaching this class for 20 years, right? You're going to get a different kind of guidance, but it's actually both are really valuable and both are really valid to call a journey master. And maybe master gets a little funky right there, right? But journey helper, journey pointer outer, something like that.
No, that's great. And what I was going to say is maybe we'll go through the other three. And if you have good archetypal figures that kind of express these qualities, let us know at the end. So keep that question on your mind as we go through. That's great. Chris, do you want to do worldview, or do you want me to do one?
Well, I'll do worldview, but let's just shuffle it up so it's not me talking so long all at once.
Yeah, great. So let's switch to, so the next one is intentional communicator. And this one might be a little bit easier to describe because there's a lot of specific examples on how we can intentionally communicate, right? So this one needs a little bit less depth or width in it, but it's really, and when I say, I love that it's an intentional communicator, not just speaker. And let's start with sometime the thing that we end with is deep listening. Who can listen really well in our guide team? Or who's just going to play that role of a really good listener today, right? You don't have to be the entire trip. And maybe that's listening to the specific students, and maybe that's listening to the larger group. Maybe that's also listening to nature. And deep listening usually opens up doors for a lot of really intentional communicating. And that could be verbally, that could be non-verbally. But that's someone who's very conscious, if we are speaking verbally, of the ways that our words may have impact, especially when you have a group of young people. Oftentimes you are in constant vigilance of these young people, right? They're looking towards you, or they're really, really specifically listening to what you say, maybe for preference, or maybe for rejection, or maybe for insight, right? But they're absorbing a lot. So our words do have a lot of power. And our words are also in addition to, if we are in a guide and if we are of a different age, there is a power dynamic. So being really attentive to how are my words enforcing a power dynamic that is necessary, right? Like I am the one that is responsible for safety at the end, right? Versus a power dynamic that is not necessary, you know? And is there a different way that I can use my words to help navigate those kind of complex boundaries sometimes? I'd say especially intentional communicating with adolescents, young people right now around their identities and around inclusion, and also around diversity and around where we are not the same, and how to provide spaces for both. Spaces for, hey, there is space for us to all have something that is similar and can weave us together. And there's also space where diversity can be articulated in our words, and how to balance that. Because that can be a tricky balance right now in working with groups of youth, right? If we only look towards how are we diverse and how are we not like each other, sometimes we don't ever get the group cohesion that we actually need in order to understand, in order to be in relationship. Words can have a lot of power on this. This is a very wordy 2 weekends. So obviously we're giving a lot of examples of what this can be, but just to say that words can come out didactically, they can come out in poetry, they can come out in story, they can come out in song, right? And that we can communicate in so many other ways than words. But great tools out there. And maybe intentionally communicating is this kind of goes into revealer of wonder, which is a different category, but pointing out like there's a bird language, there's a plant language, right? There's a language of our nervous system, and we are also animal, right? teaching the brain, right? That could be an intentional way of communicating and giving them information so that later on you might be able to intervene in a crisis with a simple hand motion. I'll pause here. What's bubbling for people? I think we've all received, as people who facilitate or guide, we've probably received a lot of information around communication. Questions? Great. I don't need to over communicate communicating. I'll pass it back to you, Chris.
Hey, I'll do that. There's one piece that I would like to highlight, and I feel like it's just getting more and more important these days, which is to really focus on the concept or the idea of integrity in communication. You know, is what you're saying really congruent with how you're being, with your body language, you know, versus your word language? And more and more we're hearing this term gaslighting nowadays and becoming quite familiar with it. And this idea that messages are mixed is a real source of painful confusion and frustration, and then it can actually really thwart human development to be in a situation where we're getting mixed messages like that and we don't know which one is the right message, right? So just being really conscientious of that as a communicator in working with people is that, like, you don't have an unspoken criticism in your mind while you're giving a compliment, right? And that somehow that comes through. People get it. You're like, wait, but there's something you're disappointed in me about, but you're not saying anything. And if I ask, you say, oh, no, nothing's wrong. But there's something wrong, right? What do people do with that message? So the integrity to be able to say, even if it's as simple as, like, I know I'm having a really bad day and I really am kind of off my center and I'm finding myself like annoyed right now, and please don't take it personally. Like, but that's real. That's there. You're picking up on that. I think is so much more healthy for someone than to just be like, oh no, nothing's wrong, because I somehow, you know, don't want to shame them or give them the opportunity to think that I don't like them or something like that. It's actually really important to be in integrity with who you are and how you are in that moment with people, to the extent that you can share appropriately, right? So integrity is a really important part of intentional communicator for me.
Tanner had a great example yesterday. Good job versus good effort. Tiny few words could have huge impact. I love that example.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Well, a third role that guides will play in these kinds of experiences is the role of the worldview expander. And again, this can be kind of on all different levels of what are we talking about by worldview. But I think a couple of the easy levels to grasp, to start at the individual level, right? That all of us, like, part of how humans navigate the world is we tell stories about the world. We tell stories that sort of make sense of the almost endless minutia of events and happenings in our life. The stories create this narrative structure that makes it all make sense. So we tell stories about ourselves. And sometimes those stories that we tell about ourselves and our lives are unhelpful. They hold us back, or they limit us in some way or another. And so the idea of a worldview expander in this concept is so common at rite of passage journeys. Hearing someone say some version of "I can't" and offering them a way to expand their worldview to include "I can," right? This is the story they're telling about themselves. So expanding their worldview in some ways is as simple as saying, helping them tell a new story, a bigger story, a wholer story, right? A story that allows them to expand in a way that is going to fulfill their life, right? And enhance their life. And likewise, that can be regarding the stories they tell about others, right? Maybe getting into a conflict with someone and finding that they've got a real sort of stereotype or some kind of way that they're holding this other person that's a negative, you know, way, and trying to facilitate the kind of interaction or conversation about that dynamic that gives them the ability to replace that old limiting, constraining story about that person being a jerk, right? Or that person not liking them. And as a result, they're behaving in this way because they just don't like me and they want me to suffer. And instead, supplanting that with some other kind of story that maybe makes room for understanding, like, well, what reasons might they have for behaving like that that don't have anything to do with their opinion of you, but have to do with themselves, protecting themselves, or them, needing to make sense of the world and make themselves feel good or okay or something like that, or a misunderstanding and just not understanding what you meant by that or whatnot. So that broadening worldview of, oh, right, like there might be more than one meaningful interpretation of an event or a sentence that's uttered by someone, And the classic example that I learned from a course I took from an organization called Landmark Education was one of a story of somebody who, as a grown adult, would constantly come back home for holidays or for whatever reason. They would come home, and every time mom would ask them, "Hey, have you met anyone, honey? Have you met anyone?" And it became this just incredibly painful thing to be going back home because they knew they're gonna get met with this. I'm such a disappointment to my mom because I haven't met anyone. She's going to be grilling me about whether I've met someone, and so it was this really misery. And then one day when she said that, he heard something different. What he heard was, "I love you. I really want you to be happy in a way I know, is a way that you can be happy in this world, which is to have a partner, which is to have someone in your life. Like, so I want that so badly for you. I love you so much." And when he heard that, it was like, no longer a painful experience to come home and have mom asking whether he'd met someone. It was just like, "No, not yet, mom," or whatever it was. And so that expanding of the worldview of like the story you're telling about something, even on those sort of small levels, is a huge part of what we end up finding ourselves doing as worldview expanders. And that can have a whole lot of different sort of contexts and focus of what kind of worldview are you talking about. Maybe depending a little bit on your context and who you're working with, or whatnot. But that all makes sense as far as expanding people's worldview. And yeah, mostly what we're talking about is expanding, right? This idea of adding to, biggering, allowing someone to get bigger for their benefit, right? So that it really helps them be more fully who they are and experience the world more fully. There are times when guides, myself included, have fallen into the trap of proselytizing, thinking that, like, especially as regards to, say, maybe environmental ethics and things like that, right? That we can expand their worldview by telling them the right way to think about something. So I strongly encourage you, try and avoid getting into that mode of thinking around this, like that their worldview is wrong. Talking about it as being limited or insufficient or small is, I think, different than from wrong or problematic or needs to change into this particular way of thinking. I think there's a role for that, for advocacy of certain kinds of things, but I also am, I'm just a little nervous. I'm tentative of stepping too strongly into that role because of the, I think, closing down effect it can have of people potentially feeling shamed about who they are now. And then you sort of shut down this whole process of being willing to be vulnerable and expose yourself in this rite of passage journey. So we'll try whenever possible. And sometimes we encounter pretty nasty stuff, right? Just straight up transphobic language and behavior happened last summer. And it was one of these things where it's like, all right, we're not just going to step in and say that's bad and wrong, but we've got to do something to help shift this worldview. And also, of course, protect the youth on the trip for whom that was really painful and harmful. So that's a pretty extreme example that happened just this past summer of trying to really find what is that line that we're going to take around expanding someone's worldview, but at the same time, having it be something that's being offered as opposed to something that's being demanded of them that they expand their worldview.
A way that this can happen is also through wonder and curiosity and imagination and storytelling. There can be a direct way of expanding, and then there can also be almost an indirect way of expanding that is a group effort. It doesn't necessarily have to come from my single individual knowing of the world, but let's have a time every day. This is a very silly example, but it helps. balance, I think, the gravity of what worldview expanding is right now, because it's a pretty responsible, heavy thing to hold. The other side of it is, before breakfast, let's imagine 10 things that we've never imagined before. Right? And I know that's very simple, but we're talking about a huge range of ages here. And sometimes a worldview expander could be allowing someone that didn't get that explorer in the garden kind of wonder, maybe they had a more directed childhood, to just have curiosity about how whales sleep, right? Or any other ways. And practicing it in a more neutral environment sometimes kind of like primes the group to be a little more open when it becomes more complex environments, like how do we relate around culture and respect, or how do we relate around race or gender? So just wanting to say, like, kind of, this can be a thing that we practice as a group, because it's practicing how to be open-minded and open-hearted and wonder and curiosity. It can be hard. Good. Anything else on worldview expander from you all? You got one more role of the guide, and then I want to hear what people's examples are of characters in our commonly known culture that represent these. Cool. Yeah, Jean Marie.
Share one thing. In my 20s, I had a friendship with a professor at a university, and I always, I was explaining to him that I felt a little like shy because I felt like I just didn't have the experience that he had. And he said to me, you can only be where your experience has brought you. So keep giving yourselves new experiences that will take you to new places. And it was one of those pieces of wisdom that just has stayed with me my whole life in terms of its world expanding possibilities of, to not feel like, there's something wrong with you that you don't have, but your experience hasn't brought you to. So.
What a beautiful moment of mentorship.
Mhm.
Very cool. And so with that, I'll just kind of piggyback off of what you just said. And the last role that we've identified here, and there's many more, is just revealer of wonder. Revealer of wonder. I think we've alluded to this many times throughout, right? But really role modeling where, or giving permission, I will also say, where are there opportunities to be in states of wonder? And very simply, are there times of day, sunrise, sunset, super conducive to revealer of wonder, stargazing, super conducive to revealer of wonder. And simply sometimes it's setting the container or the space or the time frame for wonder itself to grow is the real nuanced beauty of playing this role, right? Okay, y'all, we're gonna stargaze for 15 minutes and we're just gonna stay in silent and see what you see, right? That can reveal a lot of wonder. This is how do we evoke the childlike qualities, right? And not necessarily the childish, but the childlike, that kind of awe of a dewdrop, right? Or the awe of a spider web. And it's also, how do we carry it as adults, right? How do we not necessarily grow out of our ability to have wonder or awe? And how can we still express it and need it, receive it from other people in adult bodies, right? Because we definitely have the children in there. And then this also, going back around to this morning, really evokes gratitude for a gift that young adolescents or late childhood might carry, right? They might carry a lot of wonder. And by you acknowledging that it's an important part of your guiding role and your role as an adult, it could really give them a sense of purpose. Right? And even in what you said, Jean Marie, that simple sentence was also the invitation for, I wonder how many different experiences are out there that you will accumulate in your life. And that there is the version of you that gets to look back at that version of, young you that received that. Right? If you're working outside in nature, this element of being a guide is a lot easier, right? Especially if kiddos are in environments that they're not super familiar with. Or even if they are familiar with it, but they haven't necessarily gone to sleep outside, or they haven't figured out how to go to the bathroom outside, right? There can be a lot of wonder in very simple, how do humans function without the insulation of living indoors, right? How do we cook on a fire? How do we poop in a hole? Right? How do we wash our hands? Like super simple things. Can you bring an element of wonder to it and curiosity? And as you'll see, like these 4 roles of a guide, they can all weave together, and sometimes they can be very separate and different. And maybe you have a little bit of all of them, or maybe there's one of these roles that you're like, I know that that's kind of my default go-to. I know when I need to get a group's attention, I immediately go to like, where can we have some awe and wonder and curiosity? What's bubbling for people? Anything bubbling? Anyone got good cultural role models or archetypes or caricatures of these 4 categories?
I have to admit that the invitation to do that became like a huge distraction for me.
Sorry.
I just want no apology necessary. Just acknowledging that, like, that brought out the side of me that like to play and wanted to like go into stories and explore. So it was a little harder for me to like just focus on taking information in, but whatever, that's part of the journey. We just had a movie night this past night at my program, and we watched Kiki's Delivery Service, the Miyazaki film, which is so lovely and such a great story around like getting in touch with your thread. That like there's like a whole journey that Kiki goes through. For those of you who have seen it, if you haven't, you should, if you want. And but there's this character of Ursula, who's in there, who is this, sort of, I feel like maybe kind of close to a journey guide or shepherd, in the sense that like, she's sort of maybe further along in the journey of being in touch with her thread. She's a painter in the woods, and Kiki encounters her at these times when, of like trial, and there's sort of that like, they're not too far apart in age. There's maybe a little bit of a peer mentoring vibe, but just that sense of being a little further along and seeing, kind of witnessing Kiki on her journey and being kind of with her in that and mirroring back, kind of the trials and the gifts that she brings. So yeah, that one was the one that was sticking with me.
That's great. Thank you. A little bit of me is grateful that it was distracting and playful. It engages a different part of our brain. I just read a beautiful thing that when you're learning something through play, it not only halves, but it quarters the amount of repetition that you need to do in order to learn it versus if you're learning something not in a playful way. So amazing. Tanner, I saw that you unmuted.
Yeah, in regard to picture, a person or a role model to this guide situation, I just read The Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway. And it's really kind of nuts how he almost hits every single mark in regard to being a journey master, the worldview expander, teaching the young boy about the ways of the ocean. What's really kind of neat is the intentional communicator. It's almost like an adverse effect. They spoke about how when you're out on the sea, it's almost adorned to just be quiet the whole time and just experience a lack of no verbal communication and just experiencing the sea. So it's really kind of a neat thing in regard to intentional communicator that I don't think always has to be through words. Revealing wonder, that's quite obvious. And then I think he just told the kid stories the whole time. But it's like a perfect example of a guide in that book.
I love that.
Yeah. I love that. Thanks for bringing that piece of like some of the most powerful ways you can be an intentional communicator is to really role model comfort in silence. Yeah, sort of perfect and really important part of it.
Anyone else to wrap up this section? Cool. Oh, Amanda?
Oh, I have something that's kind of unrelated, but I'm a really big fan of like, I'm taking notes of like Kiki's delivery service and Old Man in the Sea, and then like archery came up. I'm really a big fan of like just themes that come up not intentionally from people sharing. And I took my dog out at 11 p.m. last night, which I usually try and take her out at like 10 and go to bed. So I was frustrated that I was going to, so late. And for the first, and I was thinking about raccoons that I saw. And then I realized I saw a raccoon roadkill like last week. And all of a sudden I see this ginormous, I was like, that is way too big to be a cat. And it was a raccoon climbing a tree that my dog was like wanted to attack. So anyway, for whatever the raccoon symbolizes or is for you, the raccoon like popped in my head and was like, please, I want you
Huh.
to listen. So that's it.
Cool.
Very unrelated.
Thank you for sharing that. It was a good night to be out late last night. There was a lunar eclipse.
Oh, that's right.
And it was a big full moon. Good. Well, should we take a little break, Chris?
Okay.
Do a little mid-afternoon break?
Yeah, it's been 90 minutes.
Timing-wise. What do you say?
I said, yeah, it's been 90 minutes. It's a good time for a little break. So back in 10, is that what you said?
Yeah, let's do back in 10. Give people enough time to wiggle. So it's 28. Let's be back at 38. And then Chris, what timing do you think on paired share? Great, cool. So we would love to hear some pearls or some nuggets, some highlights, some insights just from your group shares. It obviously doesn't have to be the full thing, but if there's any gems to share it in the full group or inquiries that came up. And we can just popcorn style, anyone can start and then pass to the next person.
I think Amanda and I got a little bit out of, well, at least we both had a similar understanding that mentors really hold space. It felt like both of our experiences with mentors were around someone that allows us to just be, oftentimes doing a lot of listening, not attempting to fix, or in my case, shares equal experiences and allows companionship. That was what we kind of dually came together on for mentors.
Yeah, I'll also add to like mirroring or like reflecting back experiences. So you're like holding space and then you're like, okay, so I'm hearing this, or it sounds like this, or oh, I really see, you in this.
Nice. I like that. I imagine a lot of that holding energy or that element of accepting and seeing and witnessing what is, rather than kind of sticking their head in and changing what is or inserting how things could be or anything like that, but a lot of honoring what is in a way that has depth. That's neat that you both shared that in experience with mentors. Anything else from you guys or Gabriel or Jean Marie?
Do you have anything to share? Kimberly?
What did you say, Gabriel?
Do you have anything to share? I was gonna let you go first if you want.
Oh, I don't want to speak for anyone else. Just did some reflection on I'll just speak for myself, did a little reflection on just mentors who were challenging and how to hold that experience and how to know the boundaries of when to challenge and how to challenge in a way that's, you're really reading the person carefully to what they can handle.
Yeah, some girls for me were also about challenge. What Marie shared helped me to kind of reflect on how that's that element of challenge has been important in mentoring relationship in my life. And then talked a little bit about the importance for me of having mentors that also reflect some of like who I am in the world in ways that I haven't always had access to, particularly around queerness. Valuable. And then another qual was like just that resonated with me from some of Jean sharing. It's just like the opportunity to like be open to like as I get more generationally distant from those folks that I work with. I'm growing older, and the group that I'm working with stays in that same age range. Like the opening and chance to grow and like intergenerational learning.
Interesting. I'm intrigued by the thread between both of you on the role of challenge within a mentor. And that's not something that we specifically spoke to, but I think it's interesting that it came up for both of you. I feel curious about your conversation, but it's also making me reflect on, I have a very obvious mentorship relationship with someone that's in this work, and we have other layers of relationship. But my own as a mentee, how I receive that challenge, right? And in the moment, how prickly it is. And also in hindsight, how much those challenges have actually shaped our ability to expand our relationship, and my own ability to expand within the content of our mentorship. But they don't always land well. I will just out myself. I don't always receive them well.
Yes.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
Definitely all the places that you have defenses are places to look at.
And how to balance that, like sometimes really deeply needing the holding that Tanner and Amanda came up with, that holding of mentorship versus the mentorship that also kind of pushes, right? And what is the balance around that? And what if I need held right now and I get pushed, Or I don't want to be held anymore. Let me grow out of being a mentee, which we didn't necessarily talk about, but it comes up, right? There will be a time when the mentee says, I'm too big for this nest. Let me out. And sometimes that doesn't really happen in a graceful way. And sometimes it is graceful and they're able to be self-aware and say like, hey, I need our relationship to translate a little bit more to where I'm at in life. Or other times it could look a little different. Neat. Any other pearls?
I was just going to add like a personal example to the challenge piece and just thinking about like one of the very small ways it can happen of like I spoke with Jean Marie about a mentor who's been a guide for me in my somatics work, and I was doing a demo of a practice with them, and we were practicing for the demo, and that demo included singing because that's part of the somatic work in our group, and singing is a place where I'm growing in, and this person is a guide for me and how to use my voice and how to really step into that. And so it was just like in the moment, that we're doing a call and response, and the first round of it, and like the challenge that they had to give to me was like that simple challenge of like like sing it if you like you mean it, like really like where is your where is that coming from right there? And so it's like, it's not, you know, and it's like that thing where it's like, you know, that kind of painful push that like, I see you have more in you that than you're showing right now, than you're bringing out. Like it's a challenge in like a very like loving like way, I think. And very like, you know, they fully understand what like who I am and what I can bring. So just wanting to give a more personal examples that like kind of understand like what that challenge can look like in that kind of relationship is like, that's how I felt it. And it's resonated with me ever since. Like, I mean, I can't tell you how long in my like, you know, years of doing this work with myself that like I've needed someone to say that very directly, to push, you know, and they're very, you know, able and ready to do that in that kind of intentional communication way. Like I see you and you can do more. So yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. You know that I personally also have something with singing, so it's helpful for me to hear that example personally. And it's also, right, our mentors might know our wounds from their own thread. And so sometimes the challenges come out of love, but they hit in the place that is ouch, even if it's a small one. Right? And that was a beautifully articulated example of even just an instant, the impact and the ripple it can have, and the empowerment it can have with time, if able to be received, and if truly given from a place of love and given rather than projected. Hard. Yeah, thanks for that.
Another thing that came up is, and you touched on this with, you know, when someone's ready to, you know, grow out of the mentee relationship, is there are situations where it's a peer-to-peer. And you can't say who's the mentor and who's the mentee because you're giving back and forth. And I like to have my relationships that as much as possible, where you always see what can I learn from the other person. So I'm not in a position of I'm the authority and helping you, but we're here in this together. And you know, I recall just a few years ago having a relationship with a psychotherapist where I had to challenge her on something, and she just blew up and couldn't take it at all. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So it was kind of me saying, you know, I'm owning my own discernment. I have a lot of background in psychotherapy. I'm not a therapist, but I know what you're doing doesn't feel right. And and she couldn't handle it. But it was time for me to fly that nest.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. And that sometimes that's just a total natural cycle. If it's time for me to fly that nest, or sometimes there's a rupture where that nest isn't a space that we want to be in anymore, you know, and acknowledging that we're definitely our humanness is not excluded in this beautiful mentorship mythology that includes Athena, you know, like I'm like, oh gosh, that sounds so nice. And sometimes I feel like I'm face planting in this, right? And so our humanness is also in the mix. And it's really great to practice a lot in our personal lives when we're not also holding that extra layer of complexity of being a guide or being an employee or being, you know, a guardian of someone else's child for 3 weeks. So it's really neat to hear people's personal experience and reflection on it too, because I think the most I've learned has been in hindsight. In guiding, we'd often say like hindsight, you have 20/20 vision. Like if you look over your shoulder, everything's super clear. If you're looking forward or even in the moment, sometimes it's a lot more blurry. But hindsight 20/20. So thank you for these examples. They ground our work in tangible reality. Anything else? Those were great pearls. Cool. Well, we'll continue to the next piece.
Well, we've already started.
Chris, you want to start?
Uh,
We have started.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the last thing that we wanted to to end with for this weekend was to just one of those like heads up, I told you so. Like it's not all flowers and roses. That there's some prickly, difficult terrain that we're stepping into with this kind of stuff, and y'all have reflected beautifully on some of those parts of the mentoring or the guiding process that can get really messy and sticky, as you've been reflecting on your experiences with others. So yeah, I feel like we've got just some bullet points of things to share, and some have already come up. So maybe that's as good enough a place to start as any. And so I might just offer Jean Maria this sort of elaboration on the dynamic that you were going through, which feels to me to be a reflection of an archetypal dynamic of what happens when people are, as just us fallible humans, are sort of holding these archetypal roles, and just how difficult that can be. And there is, I think, a very common dynamic of the mentor or the guide gaining some like personal self-worth out of the fact that they can be an authentically helpful person in someone else's life. Like that gives us a sense of meaningfulness to our lives, to be in the role of a guide or a mentor or something like that for someone else. And so then there's going to be this part of us is loath to give that up, because it's sort of a diminishing of our, usefulness in the world, ability to make a contribution, right? So there's going to be some underlying, maybe unconscious tension there. And that comes up often in the therapeutic relationship, right? Like from the big picture perspective of mentoring and guiding, it should be fairly clear that there will always be sort of a moment of ending where someone really needs to be able to go and walk their path without someone guiding them, that it becomes a diminishment to have someone always pointing out where you should go or how you should conduct yourself or what you should do. And so I think that in, once again, just going back to my experience of working with Michael Mead and him sharing some of what Malidoma shared, there was one particular story of a very intentional way that apprenticeship and mentorship was handled in Malidoma's community, specifically regarding the healers, the people who were practicing to be healers in the community, and what was needed to finally move a person who had been in the apprentice role, looking towards the master for the knowledge and how to do this, become a healer. That person eventually needed to be able to stand and sit side by side as another healer, an equal. But they had been in this role that had a sort of an authority to it, of like, I am showing you how it is done. I am sort of conducting you into this role of learning this. And it involved this really elaborate, like staged conflict, like war, like of beating each other with sticks in the whole village. And for I think it was more than a day, like they got together and there was this whole choreographed way in which the battle was supposed to go, where sort of like the one side who were all the representatives for the apprentice, and then the other side were all the representatives for the fighting for the master, would go back and forth until finally the apprentices group wins and is able to sort of break the relationship of master to apprentice, and is finally they're able to sit together side by side and eat a meal together. So it was, I don't know that I've actually represented completely accurately the details of that, but that was the sort of the gist of it, is they really enacted this whole struggle of what it's like to have this mentor-mentee relationship or mentor-pupil relationship, and the degree to which it can be necessary to go through some pretty significant severance and breaking of old patterns in order to really be able to step powerfully into the role of the pupil. And I have seen this dynamic happen over and over again, where because we don't really acknowledge the full extent to which it's necessary to allow that to happen, and that it needs to happen on a psychological level, like, and on a soul level, for the soul to sort of step forward into the biggerness, that this dynamic of betrayal seems to be incredibly common in this area of work, especially with people working with mentors, people working with gurus, of eventually feeling some level of betrayal. And sometimes it comes from the pupil feeling betrayed by the mentor and having to storm off and leave and just completely sever ties. And sometimes it's the mentor has to have this sort of like feeling that the pupils stabbed them in the back and just completely sever ties as a way to allow that student to like get on with their life and go and no longer be looking towards the mentor. And often this is happening completely unconsciously. Like people don't think that or understand that this is an important, necessary dynamic. They genuinely feel like the other person's a total jerk and, you know, crossed a really important boundary that they should not have crossed and whatever it is. And so your story told me sort of hinted at that, this idea of like, well, who are you to cross this boundary and criticize my skill in analysis or whatever it was that she was offering you? I don't know what kind of specific, you know, thing that you differed or disagreed with, but that idea that you would challenge that can almost be a like unconscious or subconscious way of saying like, I think you're ready to go on your own now, you know, and like, I mean, I'm mad at you, but what that really means is like, yeah, you're ready to take, you know, go and find some other new place. I've given you what guidance I can. So I trust that process. I see that process as kind of this pattern that's repeating and seems very consistent, and would really love to find ways that we can acknowledge the process and make it a little more easeful for us. So I like the idea of really attending to the question. And I loved it when my therapist, you know, would always start with, or at least started with, and then would consistently revisit this question of, well, when will we know that we're done? You know, when will we be finished? And you'll know that you've gotten the guidance that you came to me to get. And then we can happily part ways, you know. I love that idea. And there's a way in which it's really nice to be able to, in a rite of passage setting, you know, ahead of time that you're leaving, you know, it's done. Like my time with you is really this 3-week period or whatever it is. And so plan ahead in terms of how can you conduct those last days to allow acknowledgement, to allow a real awareness of the fact that, yeah, this is ending. And opportunity to give that permission to, I'm really excited for you to, you know, go out and be on your own and take what I've helped you learn with you, and you know, you don't need me anymore. So that there is no need to create some kind of angry, oh, I'm pissed at you. But boy, if you don't attend to that well and endings happen, you'll see individuals just naturally start to do that and come up with something that they just end up getting really upset about, so they can leave and never see the mentor again and like have somehow finished it, when otherwise they might have gone off you know, somehow attached and thinking that they still needed this person, and now that they weren't there anymore, they're sort of stuck, and they no longer have access to, you know, the part of themselves that they were able to understand or discover as the result of the assistance or the support of the mentor. So it's I think it's a complicated but also pretty common dynamic that we get involved with. So I guess this is one of those, be careful. Like you may discover all of a sudden, what, did Chris say something about this like stabbed in the back thing? Because that's sure how it feels right now. And yeah, that's part of how this works. And sometimes we just need to do that. And the betrayal process somehow gives us the space, the separation that we really need in that moment, as painful as it might be. So that's one thing that could happen if you step into this role and this path. Tanner,
and another element that might open as a possibility. Oh, sorry, Tanner, I'll be quick. It's to practice an ending, to practice, right, a symbolic death. How do we, it's a gift to know that a relationship is ending and for us to be able to have some time to plan, to prepare to meet that. And maybe we frame it in that way, you know? Like, I think our kind of death phobic, dying phobic culture misses a lot of opportunities to practice on how to show up for endings, right? How to show up for dyings. And maybe they're graceful and they're well prepared, and maybe they're really tumultuous. I've had a lot of kids who I've had really sweet connections with refuse to give me a hug or refuse to, right, because it's too hard. And can we be with that grief? Can we be with that, like the tearing that can happen, especially if a mentorship relationship was really weaved, whether that was through time or connection or whatever it was, right? How do we show up to practice endings and dyings? And are we aware of the opportunities that show up? And how many of, you know, the missed opportunities are because we're a little phobic or fearful or out of practice or out of mentorship for how to do that? Yeah, Tanner, sorry.
That's quite all right. My question, you tagged on to some of it, was just how to avoid that. It's a tough, I think, experience. It sounds like a lot of you guys have gone through that, or you've both gone through that in some ways, but was there anything else that you could add on to that tries to help avoid that whole situation?
Yeah. As much as I would like to say yes, 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 the best thing is to not avoid it, you know, and to really meet whatever shows up. I will say, this is wisdom that Jean offered earlier, is can we plan for integration ahead of time, right? And maybe that starts at the beginning of the program. So oftentimes I'll try to do a group at the beginning of a program with youth that say, hey, we got 8 days, we got 21 days, whatever it is. This is going to be over before you know it, you know, and to have that kind of, and they'll probably forget all about this group, but that can help. And then, like Chris said, like slow down that transition. We try to have at least a day, maybe more, where we're just saying, hey, things are ending and we have some planned activities for how they end relationships with their friends, right? Because a lot of these kids might not continue their relationship. And I'd say it kind of comes back around to a combination of how do we embody or ceremonialize integration, right? And maybe that's through representation or through honoring. Maybe that's through we, you know, have water and we speak the blessing of the relationships we've had into vessels of water, and then we go to the river and we pour it into the river and the river takes it away. And it's this kind of acknowledging the door between integration and another level of severance and separation, right? Because they've got a foot in both worlds. Yeah.
The other thing that we started doing at Journeys is to have a part of the opening ceremony be a real acknowledgement that, hey, these, you know, in our case, 3 people are going to be your guides for this trip. And that's a particular role that they're stepping into. It's a really important role. And so we actually invest them with that role as part of what we do as a circle of families and whatnot, and send a little token rock around the circle, and everyone can kind of give it a little blessing of energy, of goodwill and good wishes. And then when they pick up that rock, that's them symbolically actually taking on the commitment and the responsibility of being that role of the guide. And then at the end of the trip, we divest them of that role. So we actually thank them profusely and acknowledge what a gift that was to the kids and to the group. And then we let them give that rock back and sort of step out of that role. So it's a way of trying to acknowledge that the relationship is ending. And so that hopefully is helpful. It's why we do it, is to really acknowledge and kind of give both birth and death to that particular form of the relationship. We don't discourage if there feels like there is a connection that might continue beyond the program that someone has with a particular kid, some way in which they feel they can still be supportive and have a desire to volunteer to do that. We certainly encourage our guides to follow those threads if they want to, though it is really important that they follow that thread through the parents and make sure that that connection is consensual, not just with the youth, but with the family of the youth as well. And then it's, transparent.
Some more hazards. Hazards feels dramatic, but this one we've talked about. Don't do it alone. Have a co-guide is the simplest way to say it. Have a co-guide, have an elder, have a mentor, have a supervisor, right? There's so many other roles. Have someone else, like having a co-guide, having that companionship in the field is crucial, I'd say. And it can also be really nice. Like I love that Journeys invites elders to participate in programs that they only relate at certain points and they're kind of removed from the program and they can offer a different perspective. And sometimes I've gone to those elders personally as a guide after hard programs to be like, I need some perspective that's not my supervisor, that's not my co-guide, that's not my manager. Will you please elder me? You know, and that's been really helpful. But really just accentuating, don't do it alone. Um, and think about this before you design programs, or I'd say like think about this as a foundation of programs. Who do you have access to help provide that like foundational support and then design the program, you know? Yeah, I have many examples of intentionally inviting elders in before I even know necessarily what the age range is for a program I'm offering or where it's going to be, just knowing I need some eldering in this. That's my plug. Don't do it alone.
Don't do it alone. Yeah. Well, another hazard that I want to put on your radar is that over and over and over again, very naturally and understandably, one of the dynamics that ends up happening a lot between mentors and pupils is romantic attraction. And obviously the age, you know, closeness or things will have an effect there. And there's some really different ways to approach this and talk about this when we're talking about working with minors and working with youth compared to working with adults. But some of it is actually all the same thing. And just wanting to give some of my sort of thoughts around this. It's not just mine, but with the general consensus of many of the folk that I have worked with, this idea of not just trying not to take it personally when someone falls in love with you, and that it's a very understandable dynamic to have happen, that what's really happening is that people are falling in love with themselves and they're falling in love with the world. Like they're experiencing this amazing vitality in life on programs like this. And it can often get directed towards the person who most obviously is supporting them or helping them with this process, and be attributed to them, and somehow get this sort of confusion can happen around attraction. And so to acknowledge that it can happen, for sure, it can happen, and to sort of not take it personally and just appreciate and acknowledge the fact that it's just this beautiful thing that's happening, but be really clear about it. And it goes the other way too, right? There's a lot of times when, you know, pupils will fall in love with mentors and mentors will fall in love with pupils. And again, falling in love with just the beauty and the amazing thing that happens when people blossom in this kind of rite of passage or nature exploration, nature connection experience. And there are just tons of horror stories of that confusion of what am I really falling in love with, you know, playing itself out as people try and engage with that. So I guess the relationship advice that I have around this when you're working in this is that it's clearly not appropriate at all to engage in that with minors. That's just part of our society's way of dealing with it. And so making sure that you're really supported in engaging with youth where you sense that kind of dynamic is going on by your partners, by your co-guides, and also by their family. Like it just needs to be something that gets widely distributed. The worst part about these kind of dynamics is when they're hidden or there's some shame involved or some worry or, you know, some sense that it should be secret or hidden. Anytime you are sensing that, you're probably in bad terrain. And anytime you can't talk to your co-guides about a dynamic that's happening and either how you're feeling about someone because you're worried about it or it feels dangerous, it probably is dangerous and potentially can cause a lot of harm, especially to the pupil, but potentially to everybody. So always being that idea of always being able to talk about it and acknowledge what's going on is one of the best ways to diffuse the energy of it so that the choices you can make around how you're going to interact and how you're going to respond are grounded in a mature sense of what's appropriate for the situation, rather than driven by those sort of intense feelings that can come up when there's things around attraction and whatnot happening. Was that too vague, or was that helpful, or was that just kind of, yeah, of course, Chris, I know that. But I tell you, I knew that, and I had been trained professionally, and I still fell in love with a 17-year-old, right? And it was really helpful for me to have other people who knew I was like struggling with that. And I was able to talk to them about that and get the acknowledgement that like, it's totally natural. It makes sense, Chris. But hey, it doesn't, you don't pursue that as if that's the person like that. You don't get the access to what you're longing for through that person who is 17 and is your student, right? There's too much unequal power. There's legal liability. There's just all kinds of stuff that mean that's just like, there's other ways that you can explore getting access to these things that you're longing for in your life. And you're just being reminded of them and you're able to see them. I love that. She's so beautiful. She reminds me of or invokes so much of what I long for to have in the world and to have in my life. But any human can do that if they are blossoming in the fullness of their potential as a human, right? So super helpful to have grounding center people who can help you out. And sometimes you adjust the activities and how you're working with people and whatnot, to make sure that it doesn't get too awkward or too uncomfortable for you.
If there's awkward, Gabriel, go ahead and then I'll jump in.
I was going to offer another scenario that's similar, if that feels like, because what you described, Chris, and that that mindfulness reminded me of a scenario I went through with a young person who I was working with, who was facing getting kicked out of foster care, and they were having a hard time finding an emergency placement. And I had been, I had a very positive mentoring relationship with this student, went beyond a little bit beyond like the teaching, just the guide or teacher role that I take with like the whole group of students, in terms of that kind of like that idea of like we talked about where threads cross and intertwine, where there's a little bit more of that spark of mentoring. And this student obviously felt that as well. And in the scenario that they were facing in their life, they said to their case manager, my teacher wants to take me in, will give me a home. Will you ask their case manager to talk to me about becoming an emergency foster placement for the student? And definitely not, it's like I can understand where that was coming from for that individual, and I can understand my own concern for that student's well-being, who I feel a connection to, and the mentoring connection to, and like knowing really clearly like that's not my role in this person's life.
Right.
And just how that meant having to have a really hard and direct conversation with that student of like, here's all of the things all of the ways I'm excited to be in your life as a mentor, and here's the role I can't take on, and here are the roles I can't take on. And I'm happy to walk alongside you while you figure that out with your case manager and the system, and honoring all of the pain and challenge of that for him, and just being really clear with him around what is the role that I can play, and I'm excited to play, and setting a boundary around the ones I can't. So it's really, really tough place to have come up, but it felt that example felt very similar in a sense of like that conflation of roles and how we have to be very careful and direct and clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing.
Thank you so much for putting that in.
Yeah. And I really appreciate the, in sharing the details of your example, gets to that idea of really wanting to be careful and compassionate about how you talk to a pupil if they were to approach you like that, right? They fall in love with you and they want to express that somehow with you, or like you, they've developed a sense of maybe you could be this person, this important person in my life, when it turns out that's just not going to be in a way that works. Really being conscientious of how important it'll be for you to affirm that it's okay that they feel that way, right? That it's natural that they feel that way. And hey, I understand. I also sense a trust and a level of rapport, and I really like you. I feel like we're good friends, or whatever language you could describe the quality of your relationship, and at the same time help them understand why it is beyond a certain level of appropriateness, and in ways in which it actually wouldn't serve them can often be helpful. I know when I was working with a youth who fell in love, not with me, but with another guide, I was part of the conversation and helping them just see that what are some of the power dynamics around, you know, an adult who is kind of in control of your situation to some extent, and you, and like it's great whenever it's great, but what if you guys like break up and suddenly he's not willing to drive you to the program anymore, you know, or whatever it is. Now suddenly you lose access to this program, and how is the threat of that going to potentially, you know, keep you from being really free in this relationship and really being it something that you truly want. So that knowledge of the power dynamic and how the power dynamic is really such a reason why it's an inappropriate relationship can be really helpful to share with them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We won't dive into it, but really defining what is our scope of practice and what are the systems that we have in place to help us keep within our scope of practice. And scope of practice could be, what is my specific training? I mean, I think it definitely should be, what is our specific training? And it can also be, this is something that Chris and I have come up, you know, just in recent conversation about, is the scope of the program for something that creates a sphere of like resiliency? And do we bring in a lot of diversity that might have challenges and difficulties? Or are we is our intention of the program to have advocacy and to have a lot of shared sense of connection and safety? I'd say, like, just superficially, are we creating a safe space? Are we creating a brave space? Are we creating a combination? And do we have the tools and the systems in place to navigate a brave space where things might come up that could cause hurt or ouch or challengings or difficulties, right? So kind of a very structured, if you're guiding people in the wilderness, have a wilderness first aid certification, you know, and what's the scope of this program? And I love, Gabrielle, your example kind of identified that. What is the scope of my relationship with you? Being able to articulate that helps a lot for prevention. And I think by taking time to articulate that, we help the right go more right, something I say, rather than solving problems. Those problems are hard to solve, and they're uncomfortable and they're difficult and they take a ton of energy, and you have to solve them. You can't avoid them. What can you do to help avoid those problems rising up? Sometimes nothing. Sometimes it's just going to happen. But you can create relationships with your co-guides to really help navigate that. Yeah. One more hazard that we've kind of already touched on, and then we'll wrap for the day. We put on here the realm of gender and sexuality and how to navigate that within programming, especially programming with youth. We're not here to tell you this is the right way to do it and we've figured out a way that works every time. Not at all, right? But this is something that we are evolving with in offering programming for young people right now. Right? We have a lot more questions than we have answers. You know, at what age do we offer a girls program and a boys program and a queer program? And should that be offered for the 8 to 10-year-olds? Is that only offered for the 14 to 18-year-olds? Or should we just have mixed gender groups? Should we have all gender groups? And then if we have all gender groups, how do we navigate sexuality and the fact is, as a guide, I am likely responsible for holding a lot of space in between. Like, this is not a space for physical intimacy, right? This is a space that we're going to be together. And how do we navigate that? I'm kind of unloading a lot of questions. Those are some very like real, tangible ones. And the others are, how do we create either, you know, those advocacy spaces or those resilient spaces to navigate the inquiry of gender and sexuality? And is there an age appropriate time? Or is there not? And who's making that call, right? And what is the consent to certain programs? How do we write program descriptions, right? If I write up a program description that says that this is an all-inclusive space, is that represented in my guide team? Do my guides have the ability to hold an inclusive space and the ability to step in if that inclusive space is being narrowed or contracted? I want to offer this as like, consider this with the programs that you're working in. If you're working in a single gender program, that does not mean that you all have the same gender identity, the same physical body, or the same sexual orientation. And how much information do you need to know as a guide versus what might be invasive to ask? What's privacy? Lots of questions. I will say that there are really great, thorough resources from other organizations too, that you can find with a Google search. Youth Passageways has done a lot of writing and articulation around how do we hold rites of passages around gender and sexuality, right? And I talked about kind of like the safety or precautions of guiding them. There's also a lot of inquiry of, what are the rites that serve? Do the old rites serve the rites that came from potentially a very binary culture or very binary in terms of gender community? Do we need to evolve those rites? Do we just need to expand them? Or do we need to come up with totally new ones? Just all questions. Anything to add there?
Oh, I don't think I should add any more questions.
That was a lot,
There's a lot of questions.
but it's good.
I'll
Yeah.
just want to appreciate Chris a little bit for the vulnerability around that share that he gave around attraction and whatnot to a 17-year-old. That's huge, man. Thank you so much for bringing that up. It really feels good to hear and bring into the space. It took a lot, and thank you.
You're welcome.
Which also, Tanner, like, thank you. That also kind of turns the corner to we're finishing our weekend and we're finishing our day. And it doesn't have to be a question or a comment specifically on what just happened, but just a little space before we close. Anything else that needs to be said about this weekend?
I just want to appreciate both of you for your very unique and ways of guiding this group, and each of you bringing your gifts and the articulation and the enthusiasm and the depth to which you go. It's just really been very inspiring. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, and I also appreciated having some one-on-one time, so hope we can do that again. Yeah.
Yes, assuredly.
Yeah.
It's built into the second half, and it's much more necessary for what we're going to be doing together. We're not going to be doing so much theory as practice, so we'll be practicing with each other more.
Yeah, I want to mirror what both of you just said. Yeah, the vulnerability piece, Chris, I was like, wow, that's really brave. And I think shares like that help people, come forward and express their own, vulnerabilities. And then, yeah, both Chris and Gray, you clearly have a lot of experience, and so it's cool to see the different approaches. And I really like the examples of like different rituals or different ways that, because this is so like word heavy, so to try and imagine having those experiences is really helpful. And I unfortunately will not be here on Saturday of next week, which is sad because, it seems more experiential. I'll be here I'll have to look at I work Pacific time, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. So there might be like, I could probably drop in maybe for like a little bit later for all that stuff after. So I'll look forward to checking the recording for that maybe before.
Yeah, Gray and I will maybe put our heads together around some guidance we could give you for your timing around that and what will work as far as navigating the particular content and things that we're trying to be doing at the different times on Sunday. Yeah.
For next Saturday, I won't be here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, should we talk a little bit about between now and next weekend?
yeah, a little bit of things you can do to be preparing or
Yeah.
getting ready.
Tangibly, there's things on the class doc if you are looking for notes, or if you want to add contact info. That's a great place if you want to get in touch with someone in the group. There will be contact info there. And a little less tangibly, just be aware of what digests from this weekend, what arises. I love, Amanda already brought in like the themes of what you notice. Maybe it's really mysterious, like a raccoon, and you're like, well, it would be nice if it was more obvious. Maybe stuff comes up in your dreams. Maybe you end up having a conversation with someone you work with that really digests some bit of information. So just take note of those, jot them down. We'll have a little time to check in next weekend, but that can be really helpful for how we direct and navigate next weekend, is to hear from people.
Yeah, and then maybe finally, a little bit of preparatory thinking or journaling that you could do. And specifically let you know the design of this course is going to be building towards creating a ritual space where we can do a ceremony together that will, be the intention of it is to create a space where each of us can, or I guess you all will be conducting the ceremony, so we'll be in a slightly different role. But it will be an opportunity for you to basically engage with some aspect of your journey along the wheel, and find something that you would either want to ritually move on from in your life, or powerfully step into and take up as a sort of the next step that you're stepping into, or claim that you're bringing with you. So you have an opportunity to, again, either claim a piece of your experience powerfully in a way that maybe you haven't yet, and be witnessed in doing that claiming some component of what you understand about your gift or yourself. Or you could take it as an opportunity to, it's pretty open as far as what the opportunity is for. So what I'm giving you is some of the common examples of how people have engaged with this space. And we'll have a lot of time next weekend to be more directed in giving you directions. So this is just like a brainstormy sort of opportunity to begin to think about it. What kind of what might come if you sort of reflect on your stages or your journey through the stages, as something that you would want to have some acknowledgement, that you could get finally some acknowledgement, some opportunity to powerfully claim a transition or a shift in your life. What might be let go of or given death to that has been continuing to live with you in a way that you don't find helpful, and a ceremonial opportunity to really say to yourself and to this circle of people that you're ready to step beyond it or leave it behind. So that's the kind of space we'll have. Basically everyone will get an opportunity to step in and have that part of the ceremony for themselves. So I hope that doesn't create too many questions. Don't worry about the exact form it'll take. We'll figure all that out. It'll be somewhat already set and also partially open to emergent design from this group of people building this together. But I will read the statement. I was trying to sort of expound on it, but I'm just going to read what Jacob, who works at Rite of Passage Journeys, wrote, because it's such a great sort of single sentence. What passages have already happened in your life that could be revisited and ceremonially marked to help you more fully inhabit who you are now and where you are now in your life? So that's what's ahead. And hopefully that, just knowing that and dreaming on that, just notice what thoughts come up for you, or what images come up for you, what memories come up for you about your life, might be relevant to that ceremony that we'll create together next weekend.
Cool.
All right.
I think that's all I have.
Okay, we're gonna, I think, just use the same Zoom link for this meeting for next week as well. So we'll send out a reminder at the end of the week.
And when will the
And what's helpful for us is if you know that your schedule, like Amanda, if you want to email Journeys with your schedule or email one of us, we'll put our emails on the document. That's helpful for us to know, just so we're not waiting for people. Go for it.
When will the recordings be available?
Tonight. I will get those onto, I will create a playlist and a YouTube playlist, and I will put the link to the playlist at the top of the class document. And then you click on that and you should see all the videos come up. It should be available.
And if you can make it a clickable link, that's helpful.
Yeah, it'll be a clickable link. All right,
Great.
y'all ready to be done?
It has been an
I hope you all
honor to
get
be
to
with everyone.
Likewise, I hope people get to go move their bodies, eat some good food. Thank you so much for your presence and attention.
Yeah. Take good care until we see you again next week.
Okay. Happy Halloween.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, amen.